A small loaf wrapped in linen sleeps under a blanket by the hearth, stealing warmth for tomorrow's breakfast, while a family settles on a rustling straw mattress, shoes lined like sentries at the bed's edge. In the hush, the town's curfew bell fades, and the night splits in two, first sleep, then a lamplight waking for prayers, nursing, letters, or a quiet bowl of ale-warmed broth. Did people truly rise at midnight to stir the fire and speak in low voices before drifting into second sleep? Why did neighbors share beds like borrowed coats? And why were pillows scented with lavender, hops, or a sprig of rue against troublesome dreams? A candle left too long could bring a churchwarden's knock. A whisper at the wrong door could bruise a good name, and so even rest carried rules. Stay, and we drift gently from firelit beds and midnight habits to a winter of courtroom whispers in 1692 Salem, where fear turned footsteps into testimony. Then farther back to Rome, where Fulvia's sharp letters and careful alliances shaped the lives of three powerful men. And at last to a warm August day in 1963, where a crowd moved like a tide toward a microphone and a promise. Tonight is a soft walk through rooms of sleep, rumor, resolve, and hope, quiet steps, steady breath, and stories that know how to keep the dark small. Hey friends, tonight we'll walk right through the heart of weird sleep habits of medieval people. Cool night air over cobbles, chimney smoke and warm bread steam, straw mattress rustle, a faint bell, ink drying on ledgers, wood grain under fingertips, corridor hush, coals settling, distant hoofbeats, candle wax softening, and a slow river of mist by the fields. Before we begin, please like and subscribe only if this truly helps you unwind. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now lie back and get comfortable. Let's begin tonight's story. Hello, dear listener, and welcome to our tale of weird sleep habits of medieval people and more. The day closed early. The light fell off the fields and slipped into lanes where shutters drew in like eyelids. A bell told people to bank the fire and mind the doors. Some called it the curfew bell, the cover fire, a reminder to lay a lid of ash over coals so a spark did not wake the whole street. After that, night spread in layers, thin at first, then thick, and homes settled into patterns that were familiar and strange at the same time. Beds were not always rooms of their own. In many houses, the bed stood in the main hall, a great wooden frame with a straw-filled mattress and heavy curtains to keep in warmth and give a sense of privacy. The curtains helped against drafts that crept under doors and through the cracks in timber walls. In winter, hot stones or a pan with glowing embers passed under the sheets to chase the cold from linen. The work was careful because flame was a neighbor everyone feared. This was a world arranged around coals, candles, and respect for the night. People did not always sleep in one long block. Many households followed a rhythm that later writers would call first sleep and second sleep. You fell asleep soon after the curfew bell, and around midnight you woke in a dim pause. The house was quiet. A few coals breathed low. Someone stirred the ash, checked a baby, said a prayer, shared a cup of warm ale with spices, or simply thought. Then, after this open middle of the night, people lay down again and slipped into second sleep until dawn. This pattern fit a world without bright glass bulbs or strict factory clocks. It matched the pace of seasons, shorter days, longer nights, and tasks that waited for morning. The middle night hour was not empty. A baker might rise then to start dough because bread needed time and steady heat. A weaver could tie a broken thread by the hearth and listen to the rushlight hiss. A mother nursed, A father checked the door and listened for the town watch calling the hours. If a neighbor's cow showed signs of calving, feet found the lane half by memory, half by starlight. The night belonged to soft voices and close work. Sleep itself looked different. Mattresses were sacks called ticks, stuffed with straw, chaff, or sometimes feathers if a family was lucky. They rustled and had to be refilled and beaten out to keep their shape. Pillows were not always plentiful. Bolsters ran the width of the bed, and heads shared them like a long cushion to keep bedbugs and worries away. People tucked herbs into little pillows. Hops were common, as were lavender and rue. The scent eased the mind, and many believed certain plants guarded dreams. Clothes did not travel far. A nightshirt, a cap to keep heat from slipping out through hair, woolen socks, if the air cut sharp. These were simple helps. Children slept many together. Servants found a spot on a truckle bed that slid out from under the main bed, or they kept near the embers in the hall. Apprentices in shops went to lofts above their work. Travelers at inns often shared a mattress with strangers. That sounds odd to modern ears, but in a world of long roads and scarce rooms, bed sharing was normal. The test of comfort was warmth, safety, and a place to close your eyes. Light controlled everything. Candles were dear, and tallow smoked and singed the air. Rushlights, dry rush pith dipped in fat, were cheaper but burned fast and uneven. People used them with care. A snuffer pinched a wick. A small horn lantern cut wind. These choices shaped how long a person sat up, how quickly they walked to bed, and what they dared to do in the pause between sleeps. Rules followed the dark. In towns, watchers walked in pairs, and fines waited for reckless flames. Some churches kept their own hours, and monastic houses rose at night to sing. Imagine a winter abbey, stone cool to the touch, where bells stirred a line of sleepy shapes who walked by lantern to a stall and spoke ancient words into the hush. Their days were a ladder of set prayers, matins before dawn, then lords with the first grey holding the night like a bowl so it would not spill. The body had its own old ideas. Many believed that lying on the right side was gentler on the heart and the digestive humours. Physicians, reading learned books, left notes about warm drinks and mild herbs before bed. People swore by a small cup of spiced milk or ale, something like a posset, to settle stomach and spirit. Honey sweetened the cup. Nutmeg or cinnamon in tiny pinches felt like a luxury. Water kept in the room at night, for such drinks had to be protected from soot and insects, and so lids and covers mattered. Dreams had weight. Books that explained dreams travelled from one tongue to another, and though the church asked for caution, people still told one another what a dream might mean. A black dog at the foot of the bed was a bad sign to some, a simple neighbour's hound to others. The nightmare was not yet a movie monster, but the feeling of something heavy pressing down when sleep and waking crossed. To guard against fear, families said a verse, signed themselves, or turned the pillow. Small actions gave control where little could be controlled. There were mild debates even then. Should children sleep by the hearth or near elders? Should windows be cracked to let night air pass, or should they be shut against illness? Some swore moving air brought fever. Others believed a tight, still room fed bad humours. The practice changed with weather and custom, and every house found its own path through the cold months. In farms, the hour before dawn drew men and women from beds for animals that depended on them. A barn knew the heat of beasts, and breath rose like ghosts. If a boy woke from first sleep and could not find the second, he might sit on a stool and mend a strap, listening to the slow shift of a cow and the small clicks of settling timber. He had his own bundle of herbs for his mother's pillow, tied with hemp cord. He hoped the smell of hops would bring her deeper rest, because tomorrow she would rise to need and trade. In towns, the craft day began early. A tanner did not keep gentle hours. A smith watched his fire like a friend who got excited and needed minding. Many crafts imposed their own sleep on the house. The rhythm ran not by numbers on a clock, but by tasks that loved the morning or the cool of night. Beds themselves were furniture, but also treasure. An heir might receive a bed with all its appurtenances, meaning curtains, coverlets, mattress, and the wood that held them. Records show beds passed from mother to daughter. They held memories. A fever fought off, a child welcomed, a night of long talk during the mid-sleep pause when secrets felt safe in the dark. Linen mattered. It touched skin every night, and washing linen took time and strength. Not everyone washed sheets as often as any of us might like now. They aired them on clear days. They beat them and scoured stains with ashlie where they could. There were quiet courtesies. Shoes were set neatly near the bed, toes pointed the same way, so a pre-dawn reach did not trip the room awake. Fire irons stood within reach. A covered pot waited for bodily needs. A jug and small basin sat for a quick splash in the morning. People kept order because order kept the peace when light was scarce. Community reached into sleep. The watch announced the hours not only to show they were awake, but to keep a gentle hand on the town's heartbeat. If the bell rang out of turn, bodies sat up at once. Was it fire? Was it a call for the hue and cry? And then silence again, unless someone's cow wandered or a roof shook in wind. In some places, superstition said not to whistle at night, not to call names across a lane after curfew, not to speak the dead aloud. In other places, songs drifted from alehouses, because not every rule held and not every bell hushed human joy. Travellers learned the village ways quickly. At an inn, you might draw a curtain on the side of a wide bed to make a little night of your own. If a stranger coughed and turned, that was life. If you rose after first sleep to say a prayer or write a line by candle to someone far away, ink held your warmth while the rest of the bed cooled. A careful hand shaded the flame with a palm. Wax ran, and the smell marked your fingers all the next day. Some customs can be misunderstood when taken out of place and time. There were regions in later centuries where courting couples spoke under a blanket in winter. Supervised in ways meant to protect honor while allowing talk. Over time, stories grew around this, and jokes grew too. But the point was winter night, small houses, and the wish to judge a future partner through conversation. The aim, whatever the risks, was not scandal, but the making of a life in careful steps. Communities watched reputations closely because a bad word could follow a person for years, and the law might step in if promises were made and broken. Night carried law, family, and faith. Church wardens checked for safe chimneys. Towns had bylaws about open light after certain hours. Not all were enforced with the same weight, but the knowledge lived in the back of the mind. Do not let a flame run free. Do not let a loud voice wake a street. Keep the peace that darkness demands. Quiet was not only a comfort, it was a duty. Weather made its own rules. In summer, sleep might break into shorter pieces because heat drove a person to the bench by the door, where air moved. In spring, lambing nights pulled farmers out again and again. In autumn, harvest exhausted bodies so deeply that first sleep and second sleep felt like 2 steps on a single stair. In midwinter, Long darkness invited the layered pattern most clearly. Sleep, wake, sleep, wake, sleep, and then pale morning on frost. Even in cities, where work crowded the day, people took the night in handfuls. A scribe copied a page while the world dozed. A midwife felt her way through streets she knew by posture and sound, answering a soft knock. A father tended a banked fire and listened to his family breathe, deciding if the logs could last. The smallest choices, how high to stack the wood, how wide to draw the bed curtains, marked the boundary between comfort and a cold that cut to the bone. The body's aches were handled with home care. Warm cloths, herbal rubs, a pillow mixed with hops to quiet a racing mind if nightmares came too often. Advice circled through talk and parish notes. Keep the last meal light. Say your evening prayers. Avoid the heavy cup. Air out the mattress. Seek counsel if the same dream returns. The boundary between lesson and superstition was thin, but people did their best with what they had. When people say medieval, they often imagine a single way of living. In truth, sleep varied by place, wealth, season, and work. A merchant with a ledger to balance might sit up by candle after first sleep. He wrote figures with cold fingers, thinking of ships due with wool in the spring. He planned to pay an apprentice and buy a better mattress for his wife, who turned on her right side to calm a sour stomach. In a letter, he might ask a friend for advice on the price of hops, not only for brewing, but for pillows. Even in accounting, the night crept in. Festivals broke patterns. On Saints' Eves, towns glowed later, and songs bled into first sleep. In some places, people kept watch all night in church, candles reflecting in eyes that wanted both devotion and a nap. Winter feasts made the middle night wake cheerful with broth or spiced wine. Laughter warmed rooms as well as any coal. Children learned the steps as they learned to walk. Sleep now, and if you wake, you may speak to the fire, then sleep again. In the morning, they told their small dreams. A mill pond froze. A cat purred, heavy as a stone, at their feet. A neighbor's story about seeing lights beyond the hedge turned into a game. Fear had a place, but it did not own the night. Rituals did. Lay the shoes, stack the wood, hang the snuffer on its nail, speak a blessing, pull the curtain, let the house breathe. Not everyone enjoyed deep rest. Pain, hunger, and worry kept eyes open. In the records, we find hints, a woman's note about soothing her husband's cough with time, a clerk's complaint about cold fingers and blotted ink, a servant's memory that the rushlights ran out too soon. Yet, even then, the pattern of 2 sleeps gave people a second try. If the first was thin with coughs and thoughts, perhaps the second would be thicker, safer, kinder. By dawn, birds started the day in hedges and rafters. Someone pushed the curtain aside and felt the chill on cheeks. Coals became flame again. The pot went on its trivet. Bread warmed. Boots found feet. The whole room returned from the slow river of night to the errands of morning. If you asked a person then how they slept, they might answer not with one word, but with a small report. First sleep came easy. I woke in the middle and said a psalm. The baby took milk. Then I slept again and dreamed I was in the field. It will be a fine day. We can still read the night in the things they left behind: curtain rings, carved smooth snuffers with long legs, headboards with marks from years of hands, little sachets for herbs, wills that list a bed with all, fines for unsafe flames, sermons that warn against rum-fueled rambles after the bell, and stories that begin with a person awake in the middle of the night, listening, thinking, choosing. From these pieces, the bed becomes more than furniture. It becomes a stage where law, custom, care, and love all took their turns. If there is any strangeness here, it is only the strangeness of a life that paid attention to the dark. They respected it. They made rules for it. They used its pause to pray, patch, plan, and speak. And when daylight returned, they carried on, knowing they would meet the dark again and manage it once more. Today's echo. When your screen wakes you at 2 a.m., remember they had a middle hour to meant for a breath, a sip, a thought, and then a gentle return to sleep. A winter street held its breath, and inside a timber-bird house, a dozen small habits kept the darkness friendly. Someone laid a staff across the door latch, not as a barricade, but as a reminder no need to startle awake at every creak. Someone else set a small cup and a jug near the bed, a wool cap folded on the stool. The day's last heat clung to the hearthstones, and the banked coals made a faint red eye in the grate. In the hush, it felt as if the whole town had agreed to hold still until the cock crowed, and yet the night was not empty. It was busy in soft ways. The watch moved like a slow pendulum on the lane. 2 voices met at corners, traded a word, and drifted apart again. They listened for open flame, for shouts, for the strange ring of iron at the wrong hour. Their lantern glass smudged the snow with yellow ovals. They knew which windows leaked talk after curfew and which chimneys needed a mason. A dog lifted its head when they passed and settled again. Even the rules had a bedtime rhythm firm enough to keep roofs safe, loose enough to let a baker stir and a midwife come and go. In one small house, a child woke between sleeps and studied the shadows on the bed curtain. The curtain was a quilt of inherited pieces, blue from a gown, brown from a cloak, pale stripes from an old sheet. The child could tell which patch touched the wind by the way it moved, and which hung quiet against the frame. On the settle by the fire, the child's grandfather dozed with his feet toward the heat and his hands tucked in his sleeves. He would say in the morning that the middle hour was good for joints. The warmth reached deep then. The child's mother turned the pillow so the cool side met her cheek, and the scent of hops rose again, steady and soft. Time itself felt different in houses like these. Few people owned a clock with a face. Bells kept the town's sense of when a thing should happen. Dawn came when the east window grew grey behind the shutter, when birds began their small work, when the baker's boy crossed the lane with flour dust on his elbows. Midnight was not a minute, but a mood, the place between the first darkness and the second. Many said, after the first, sleep rather than 12, and before cockcrow rather than 4. The body understood. It had its own calendar of muscle and breath, its own timetable for rest. Let us step through doorways and see how different lives met the same night. In a monastery set in a bowl of hills, the bell for matins shivered the air. Brothers rose from narrow beds, drew on habits, and filed through cold cloisters into the choir, where stone remembered the day as heat and let it go. They sang in Latin, words older than their fathers. Owls answered from the woods. When the office ended, some returned to their cells for second sleep. Others, with permission, read or copied by lamp for an hour. Light was a measure of duty, and the flame could not be wasted. Wicks were trimmed with a care that felt like prayer. In a widow's cottage near the river, a rushlight burned down and was tended with a small pinch of damp fingers. She had a ledger page tucked under a platter to keep it safe from ash. The page held the names of people who owed her for mending, and people she owed for yeast and salt. She would not make figures at night if she could help it, because one blot set the sums against her. But after first sleep, the cottage was so quiet that the numbers felt like stepping stones. When she lay down again, she made plans for the morning. Turn the mattress, beat the ticking, check for moth in the stored wall. On a barge, under a low bridge, a boatman woke to the scrape of rope on wood. He had no bed curtain, but he had a coat and a second coat under it. The river's air was a wet knife. He wrapped his hands in rags and counted the beats between drips from the bridge stones. He knew how to sleep in handfuls, the kind of rest that comes in 3 or 4 pieces and still adds up because the tide kept its own schedule. When his wife came with the lantern to ask if the chords were sound, they spoke in short phrases. No echo was allowed on water at night. The sound carried secrets as easily as song. In a manor house where the hall fire always found wood, the great bed held a small world. The frame creaked like a ship as people shifted. A servant slid from his truckle bed to put his master's calloused heel back under the coverlet. A child who had crept into the big bed at some point in the evening lay sprawled across 2 pillows, mouth open, dreaming of a kitchen cat the size of a cart. The child's nurse told herself not to sleep too deeply in the middle hour. If she did, she would miss the best piece of morning bread. She rested her hand on the child's back and let the rise and fall count for her. When second sleep came, it came fast. The night also hosted letters. In market towns and cities, the pause between sleeps sometimes belonged to ink. A merchant who had failed to balance his accounts in the afternoon found the quiet did him good. He could hear each figure in his head without the tap of customers' shoes. In his letter to a partner 2 counties away, he wrote about the price of wax and yarn, about whether to order a bale of hops, both for brewing and for small herbal pillows that the neighbors swore by. He wrote that his apprentice snored like a mill in flood, but could be trusted to watch the shop while the family visited a sick aunt after church. When he finished, he scattered a pinch of sand to dry the ink, then laid the sheet on a stool and set a wooden bowl over it to keep the print of it from the cat, who loved warm paper more than any fire. Sleep was social in ways that can startle us. Inns offered not privacy, but room. One rented a space on a frame, not an entire chamber. A traveller learned to face the wall and pull the curtain, if there was a curtain at all. Words like watching, lying in, and keeping vigil carried their own comfort. To sit with a neighbour recovering from fever was both duty and honour. A hand on a brow, a cup of warm ale spiced with a clove, if one could be spared a story told softly while the rest of the house slept. These were hours that stitched people together more tightly than work did. Seasonal work wrote itself into the pattern of rest. At lambing, entire villages moved through the night, carrying small bodies near fires, exchanging news between fields. At harvest, people fell into bed after first dark and sometimes never caught the middle hour at all. They slept the way a scythe rests, laid down carefully, edges protected, ready to rise at the next dry day. In winter, nights lengthened like ropes, and the 2-sleep pattern felt like a generous allowance. There was time to mend, to speak, to pray, to simply be awake without needing to perform for anyone but the fire. Medicine had its say. Healers advised gentle foods in the evening and warned against heavy cups. A steaming posset could soothe a cough. Thyme and honey took their turn in a village's shared memory of what helped. Some believed the moon swayed sleep. Others kept a firm eye on humours and digestion. If a person woke each middle hour with a heavy chest, the advice might be to sleep propped on a bolster, to keep a small brazier at a safer distance, to rub the ribs with oil warmed in the hand. And behind all counsel was this bedrock: tend the fire, tend the body, tend the quiet. Belief shaped the edges of the dark. Families taught children to whisper a verse before sleep, to name the people they loved, to ask protection from fear. The nightmare that weighed on the chest when a dream pressed too hard was not a myth to them, but a sensation they worked around with named comforts. Turn the pillow, open the curtain, a finger's width for brave air. Keep a sprig of rue or a sachet of lavender under the case, and trust that second sleep would be kinder. The answers were simple, because the tools were simple, and the simplicity worked more often than not. Not all habits were gentle. There were nights when alehouse laughter pushed past the bell, and neighbors pulled a blanket over their heads to ignore it. There were careless candles and stoves that smoked. City wardens wrote down fines and warnings. A winter sermon might name a family who let their roof catch because they dried flax too near the hearth, and then because mercy had a place even in records. The parish would collect coins and labor to repair what flame had taken. Fire taught communities to care. A point often misunderstood is the way young people met and spoke in cold seasons, when houses were small. In some regions and later centuries, customs arose that allowed a courting pair to talk in winter night, while preserving honor by rules and supervision. Stories about these customs grew out of place and time and were turned into jokes that missed the purpose. Conversation without risk. Vows weighed with families near, and the belief that words shared in the pause between sleeps had a truth daytime could not find. Communities cared fiercely about reputation. A promise mattered. A broken promise was not only personal sorrow, it meant legal trouble and village memory that never quite forgot. The fabric of a bed tells its own tale. Ticks were refilled with new straw after harvest. Featherbeds existed but were precious and required regular beating to keep them from lumping. Sheets were linen where they could be, because linen washed better and dried cleaner than wool. A family with no spare cloth still learned to air their bedding on sunny days and to drape it over a hedge or a line while keeping watch for birds. Bed ropes needed tightening. Sleep tight, as people say centuries later, likely comes from that literal act, pulling a frame S crossed ropes firm so the mattress would not sag. In farmhouses, rope keys hung from a peg. Children watched the pattern of ropes emerge like a woven grid and begged to turn the key once themselves. In towns that grew bold with trade, the streets themselves gained a different heartbeat. A few shops kept long hours during fairs. A candlemaker's door showed a line even after first dark, because a household always needed one more taper. But most nights kept the old agreement. Let the dark stretch. Let the houses close their eyes. Let the middle hour belong to small repair. Tinsmiths fixed a dent. Cobblers checked the awl and set out leather for morning. Weavers tied heddles by memory and felt a quiet pride when the knots sat true, even with eyes half closed. Law and custom reached into bedrooms without shame. Not to pry though, of course. People pried, but to assign responsibility for the safety of fire and the keeping of peace. In some places, householders swore each year to mind their chimneys and keep a ladder. In others, the town listed what one could keep burning after the bell. A torch on a windy night was not courage, it was folly. A closed shutter was a favor to neighbors' sleep. These habits became so normal that people no more noticed them than they noticed the way they breathed. The geography of sleep extended beyond buildings. Shepherds learned to nap with a cloak drawn around shoulders, one ear on the flock. Soldiers in garrison took watches that cut the night into measured parts. They slept hard in between. Pilgrims on the road to a shrine shared barns and refectories, grateful for any roof, any straw. Along high roads, hospitals and guest houses provided pallets in long halls. Here, the rules changed again. Silence was a gift, but so was the soft hum of others' breath. An old woman might smile at a stranger's cough and pass him a sprig from her pouch, using the only language the night required, kindness. A house's sound map told time as surely as any dial. In the first sleep, breathing deepened. In the middle hour, a poker rang lightly against the grate. A chair leg shifted on the plank. A latch clicked as someone let in a cat who had negotiated frost for the rights to a warm corner. In second sleep, dreams thickened and the body settled into the deep kind of rest you cannot buy, only make. Then came morning, a hush before speech, the first clatter of a jug against a basin, the penny cough of someone who rose early to break ice in a pail, a whispered bargain, I will go to the dairy if you stoke the fire, and, finally, the day's first real sentence, which was often about the weather. There were humor and tenderness inside these patterns. A father, returning from the privy in the courtyard, could not find his shoe by feel and put on his wife's by accident. He made it 3 steps before the laugh broke the quiet. An apprentice swore he heard angels in the wind under the eaves. His master told him it was only the roof settling. 2 sisters traded the better pillow nightly by treaty crafted in whispers. The dog decided the warmest place was the exact center of the bed at the exact middle of the night, and proved as immovable as any church pew. These small things become memories, furniture. When people grew old, they remembered them first. Even fear had rules. When a storm rose, families gathered within reach of one another. They did not call across rooms for jokes. They sat close and listened. They counted between lightning and thunder. They told the story of the last great fire and how the town rebuilt. They noted who had a ladder and who would bring water. Fear made lists. The lists made courage. When the storm ended, they slept. Second sleep coming as a peace treaty between the house and the sky. The medieval night was not better or worse than ours. It was shaped by different tools and beliefs. Its weirdness to us is our own distance speaking. If you looked in gently, you would see care. A snuffer on its hook so a child would not pinch a wick with bare fingers. A cup where a cup should be. A window cracked or shut by choice, not ignorance. A curtain drawn not to hide shame but to keep warmth in and give the mind a smaller room to quiet itself. You would see a community that made peace with long darkness by giving it shape, first sleep, a breathing space, second sleep, and by agreeing together that the hush belonged to everyone. And there were always exceptions. Great houses, lit tapestries at late hours for a guest with stories. Poorer homes sometimes slept in one dense block because fatigue had its own laws. Men guarding a gate nodded and woke by turns. Women in labor remade the night in their own image, measured by breath and touch, by the warm cloth, by the whisper, by the candle replaced just in time. The world has never been a single pattern. It has been a woven cloth, threads crossing from cottage to city, from abbey to field. If you trace the memory of medieval sleep forward, you can see how glass, gas, and wire remade it. Light grew cheap, and the middle hour thinned. The 2-sleep habit receded in cities first, then in villages touched by factory time, but it never quite disappeared. It hides in new forms: a reader's midnight chapter, a baker's alarm, a nurse on rotation, a parent's soft step to a crib at 2 in the morning, and the way a house knows how to be quiet when someone else is awake. The old rhythm survives in the instinct to get up for a moment, stir the coals of thought, and lie down again. A final walk through that winter house. The shutter lifts at dawn. Frost lace melts on the leaded pane. Someone pulls the bed curtain back, and cold air kisses the skin in a way that makes eyes open and mouth smile. The snuffer is where it should be. The cup is half full. The child mumbles the end of a dream. A hand reaches to tighten the bed rope one more notch for the coming night. That hand is your kin across time. It reaches for the same things you do: warmth, safety, a good story before sleep, and someone to keep watch while you rest. Today's echo: if you wake in the small hour, let it be a room to breathe, intend a gentle thought, sip water, turn your pillow, and trust the second sleep waiting just beyond the curtain. Snow clung to fence rails and the meeting house door, and the village lanes of late winter 1692 carried the sound of boots, bells, and low voices that said very little and meant a great deal. In the parsonage of Salem Village, the fire was kept alive with careful hands. The minister, Samuel Perris, counted wood and coins, weighed sermons and quarrels, and watched a small household turn unsettled. His daughter Betty and his niece Abigail, once tidy at their lessons, now fell into strange fits, stiff hands, cries that bent the room, words snatched half-formed from the air as if someone else had spoken them. Neighbors came to see and to advise. Some prayed, some recommended herbs and quiet. Some watched with worry that grew a shape and a name: witchcraft. The house knew many kinds of silence. There was the good silence of early morning, and there was the hard silence that follows fear when the girl's troubles continued. The village's usual remedies: fasting, scripture, a stern word against mischief, failed to calm them. The stories people had carried from older worlds about charms and spirits sat uneasily beside sermons that warned against superstition. Yet, when a child screamed that an unseen hand pinched her arm, the bruise that rose looked like proof. In a place where faith and daily labor pressed close together, the pinch did not feel small. It felt like a door opening to a room no one wished to enter. By late February, the circle of afflicted girls widened. Ann Putnam, Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and others reported sights and pains. They named names. The first accusations settled on 3 women who stood, in different ways, at the village's edges. One was Sarah Good, a poor woman who begged at doors and carried a temper burned by want. Another was Sarah Osborne, older, entangled in disputes about land and inheritance, who had not been in church as often as others thought she should be. The third was Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Perris home, seen daily but known through the narrow window slavery allows. In a world that sorted people by standing, these 3 drew suspicion like straw draws, sparks. Examinations were set for the first days of March, and the meeting house filled. Magistrates John Hatton and Jonathan Corwin questioned the accused, while the afflicted girls writhed and gasped, claiming the women's looks alone could twist their bodies. The room was a tinderbox of worry. A word here, a tremor there, and the sense that the unseen had stepped into the scene. Hathon pressed hard. "What evil spirit have you familiarity with?" he asked. The answers did not help them. Sarah Good denied what was said of her, and was met with doubt. Sarah Osborne spoke weakly and without effect. Tituba, under threat and weariness, gave a long and winding statement that caught the village at the throat, her tale bent toward what listeners already feared. She spoke of a tall man in black, of strange dogs and birds, of a book with many marks that she could not read. She said others had signed and that a hand pushed her to harm. Whether from pressure, terror, or a wish to survive, her words piled kindling under the magistrate's certainty. If there was a book, there were many names. If there were many names, danger walked not at the edges, But through the middle of daily life, the parish did not move as one. Households divided in thought. Some people believed the girls, because their contortions were plain to see and because fear, once stirred, insists on tribute. Others were uneasy. They had lived through hard winters, bad harvests, and a recent war that pushed refugees and rumors into Massachusetts towns. They had argued over ministers and money, the line between Salem village and Salem town, and the proper way to keep order when the colony's charter had changed. Stress gathered like ice on eaves. A community already sore from disputes now had a single story to hold in common, and that story was peril. Arrests followed. Jails filled quickly from Salem to Boston, from Ipswich to Cambridge. Stone rooms meant to hold a few, now holding far more. Chains were a language the law understood. People heard them speak when carts rolled past and when keys turned at night. In crowded cells, prisoners shared blankets and prayers, and sometimes they shared despair. Those who had once been neighbors and customers now faced one another through bars, their lives turned sideways by a charge that had no edges a person could measure. The spring thaw brought not relief, but more names. Bridget Bishop, known in town for bright clothing and a temper that rose as swiftly as her voice, became a figure many thought likely to draw trouble. She was accused of sending her shape to afflict the girls, of pinching and choking from a distance, of dealing in the small mischiefs that, told often enough, grew into a larger fear. Stories from years past returned with dust brushed off. An old quarrel, a tavern word, a barn's odd creak, a child's sudden sickness. In anxious hands, these fragments made a pattern. In May, the new royal governor, Sir William Phipps, established a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to hear the cases. The Chief Justice, William Stoughton, kept a firm face and a quick pen. Spectral evidence, the claim that an accused person's spirit had harmed someone, even if their body stood elsewhere, was allowed. That decision became the axle on which the trials turned. In the courtroom, the afflicted cried out, showed invisible bites and bruises, fell to the floor, and pointed. The judges asked, again and again, if the accused would confess. Confession might mean a hope of mercy, or at least a breath before the next name, because confessions often brought new accusations. Truth, fear, and hope tangled until no one could pull the knot free. June came with a first execution. Bridget Bishop was found guilty and hanged at a small rise later called Gallows Hill. A crowd watched, with the heavy quiet of people who had come to see an answer rather than a death. But the answer did not come. Instead, whispers gathered that if one witch was gone, others remained. The law moved faster. Juries were called, confessions taken down. The afflicted continued to cry out and to fall as if struck. Ministers urged caution in public words and worried in private letters. A few, most notably Increase Mather, argued that spectral evidence was too thin to hang a person on, that it was better that 10 who were guilty go free than that one innocent lose his life. Others, including respected pastors, warned that the devil could imitate the shapes of the innocent and that only close, careful proof should guide the rope. In the village, harvest could not wait for a court's mood. People weeded, milked, mended, and tried to keep their own houses upright while watching their neighbors' doors. A cart paused. A sheriff got down. A household went still. A mother hid a child behind her skirts so the child would not hear certain words. A father laid his hand flat on a table and taught his son to breathe slow. Even those untouched by the law's hand felt it rest on their shoulders. It was a season when a person's name was part prayer and part weapon. The machinery of accusation had its habits. A complaint would be sworn, sometimes by more than one neighbour. The magistrate's warrant went out. The person was taken to a local meeting house or an inn for a preliminary examination. There, being asked if they had given themselves to the devil or signed a book, they were urged to answer neatly and quickly, as if a tidy speech could set a room to rights. When the afflicted fell or cried out, the eyes of the crowd landed on the accused like stones. If the accused looked at the floor, it was read as guilt. If they stared back, it was said their look pinched the girls. If they remained calm, they were cold. If they shook, they were hiding something. The net left little room to swim. Some confessed, some did not. Those who confessed sometimes described meetings in the woods, a black man with a book, or a strange feast. They named others. A confession might win a delay, a cell nearer the door, or simply a moment when the room's anger shifted from them to another. Those who refused to confess faced sharper winds. Their families brought bread and blankets to jails where fees were charged even for chains. A person could be poor, hungry, and still be told to pay for the iron that bruised the ankle. It was a time when mercy seemed to live on the far side of a river no one could cross. By midsummer, the circle of the accused had widened to include people of better standing, respected farmers and church members whose names rolled like stones down a hill. Rebecca, nurse, grey-haired and steady, was carried from her sick bed to the court. Many neighbours signed a petition for her, praising her character, but fear, once grown, drinks petitions like water. She was condemned and, in July, hanged. Sarah Good went to the same fate. On the ladder she spoke plain and sharp, and the words lived in the town's memory. People argued about what exactly she said, but they remembered the iron of it, the sense that even at an ending she saw a day when truth would be measured differently. August carried 5 more to the gallows, including John Proctor, who had urged the courts to slow, to consider the weight of the evidence, to distrust the sudden flood of confession and the quick sword of accusation. He spoke for a reason larger than his own safety. He spoke because he had seen neighbours undone by rumours that grew like vines on any still wall. Yet his appeal did not soften the verdict. He died with others, among them the former minister of Salem Village, George Burroughs, who, at the foot of the ladder, recited the Lord's Prayer without stumbling, a thing many said a witch could not do. For some in the crowd, that moment shook belief. For others, it hardened it, because fear has a way of learning new rules that protect itself. Back in village kitchens, people cooked and kept their children busy. Work can be a shield when fear prowls the lanes. You can tell a child to pick stones from a field and keep her near you where eyes can count her steps. You can mend a fence with your neighbour and agree to talk only of weather and harvest until the sun goes down. You can lay out linen in the yard and beat it with sticks alongside the woman whose sister sits in jail. And you can say nothing, because what would you say that could be heard? In September, the law's hand reached for the old man Giles Corey. He refused to enter a plea. He would not say guilty or not guilty, believing that if he stood mute, the court could not seize his farm from his heirs under certain rules. The penalty for silence was pressing stones laid upon the chest in a field beside the jail to force a plea. He held his mouth closed against the court's demand and answered only for more weight. He died under that weight, and the story of his stubborn courage spread like a quiet wind through houses that had forgotten how to breathe deeply. It was a hard story, heavy and simple. It asked the village whether anything was left that could halt the wheel. All through this season, ministers, magistrates, and the governor weighed words. Increase Mather and others argued publicly against spectral evidence. Governor Phipps, faced with the scale of the panic, and called away by the needs of war and politics, dissolved the special court in late October. A new court would be formed in the new year with a stricter eye. But in the village, the change felt like waking from a dream whose edges you do not at first understand. People looked at one another in the lane and did not know whether to nod. The snow that had greeted the first troubles the previous winter would come again. Before it did, harvest came in, and with it the plain tasks that rebuild a shaken life. Families gathered around tables and counted who was missing. They kept their children from standing too close to the meeting house door when it opened on to talk. They watched the faces of their leaders for signs of steadiness and hoped to see such signs in their own mirrors. And they tried, quietly, to find a way back to ordinary. At the fireside, people told themselves this, that fear can ride on the back of true piety and make good people do hard things to one another, that a village can split into narrow paths and still, in the end, find its way back to the common road, that prayer needs company from patience, that rules of evidence matter even to those who were not born to speak of rules, that law without caution is a blindfold, not a balance. They told themselves these things because they needed them to be true. We leave part 1 at a threshold. The court that fed the panic has been closed. Winter is near, jails are still crowded. Families cling to hope that the next judgments will be wiser. In the next part, we will walk the slow path through 1693 through the new trials, the easing of the storm, the late reckonings, the public sorrow, and the letters that tried to make sense of what had been done. We will listen to apologies, petitions for restitution, and the way memory, even when it forgives, keeps the shape of what happened so that a village will not wander into the same night again. Today's echo, when strong fear asks for quick answers, set another chair at the table for patience, and listen for the steady voice that does not shout. By the time ice rimmed the ponds and breath hung white in the lanes, the court that had fed the fire was gone. In late October, the governor ended the special court and sent everyone home to think. The snow that followed felt like a sheet drawn over a crowded table. It did not erase what had been done, but it stilled the noise. Jails still held men and women in irons. Families still walked to barred doors with bread, blankets, and the strength to say gentle words through little openings. The village listened for what would come next. What came was a new court with a different temper. The superior court would sit after New Year, and people said it would weigh evidence with a cooler hand. Talk ran along fences and through the meeting house porch. That wild testimony would be trimmed. That visions and dreams would not decide a noose. That names would not be stacked like kindling just to keep the blaze alive. In kitchens, hopeful sentences began, then paused. People had learned not to trust hope without proof. January brought that proof, a little at a time. The new judges sat with the cold creeping up their boots, and the juries listened with a patience born of the last year's shock. When the afflicted cried out again, the court did not lean forward with hunger as before. It asked slower questions. It wanted things that could be touched, things that could be measured. A rag with an odd stain was not enough. A quarrel told from 15 summers ago was not enough. A dream, however sharp, was not enough. Where the earlier court had accepted a story as if it were a stone, this court pressed on the story to see if it held. Acquittals began to gather. One by one, people were found not guilty and led away shaking, because freedom after a long fear makes the legs weak. In cases where a verdict still struck hard because the habits of the old months were not easy to break, the governor reprieved, and then he pardoned. He had seen how quickly certainty, once lit, had burned through neighbors and kin. He was not eager to see it catch again. The law, like the season, seemed to be thawing. Inside the jails, the thaw felt slow. Irons were heavy even when a person believed that tomorrow might be kinder than today. Cold crept along stone and up into bones. A woman wrapped a shawl around a friend and told a story from before the trouble, a small bright memory of apples drying on strings above a hearth. A man wrote a line to his wife on a scrap of paper and asked the keeper to carry it. He did not write about the court. He wrote about the cow and the fence, about a child's cough and the hope that the child was now well. He wrote to keep a piece of the ordinary alive. Fees held many like a second chain. The jailer charged for straw, for food, for the irons themselves. A person set free by the court could not step into the road without someone paid to unlock the door. Families bartered. A neighbor sold a stack of timber and added coins to a widow's hand. A parish took up a collection for a man who had at last been cleared. Freedom turned out to have a bill, and a village that had been so quick to accuse had to learn how to pay. Not every heart turned at once. Some still believed they had seen what they said they had seen. They had watched girls fall and stiffen, had heard cries and felt chills that could not be explained away by reason or season. To tell them that fear had taught their eyes to lie was to ask a hard price. The village did not demand it. It asked something humbler time, water on the coals, bread shared between houses that had not broken bread in a year. In such gestures, a road back began to show. Ministers wrote to one another in a new tone. The sharpness of defense gave way, in some, to sorrow. One judge stood in his pew on a winter day and confessed his part in the court's errors, asking God and neighbors to forgive him. A minister with ink-stained fingers drafted cautions about the use of dreams as proof, trying to protect minds from the very fire that piety had helped to light. There were still voices who warned that the devil could twist the appearance of the innocent, but louder now were voices who repeated a simple rule: do not spill life on the strength of a vision. The meeting house felt different when the court was not its center. People listened to sermons, not for weapons, but for warmth. They watched the minister's face for signs of a gentler season. Some wanted him to say, clean and plain, that what had happened was wrong. Others wanted him to move on, to speak of covenant, crops, and the steady patience of God. He stood between those wishes and tried to make a path that did not snap underfoot. He preached on peace, on neighbor love, on the small practices that heal a torn cloth, visit the sick, help the weak, speak honest words, keep the fire safe, let your yes be yes and your no be no. These were not grand thoughts. They were a way to live. Households did their own repairs. A woman returned a borrowed kettle and held a friend's hand longer than the trade required. A man who had said too much last harvest carried a ladder to his neighbor's roof and said nothing as he set it, but stayed to hold the rungs while a tile was mended. Children were told not to repeat old stories in the lane, not because truth should be hidden, but because old stories, said too often, can grow into new harm. You could hear, on any given morning, the sound of things being fixed, hinges, fences, and the unspoken bonds that hold a place together. Paper carried more than sermons. Petitions for mercy crossed the snow. People who had dared to sign for a neighbor before, when it was hardest, found their names looked different now, less like a risk, more like a thread that had kept part of the village from falling open. The families of the dead began their own slow work. They stood on ground no one knew how to make level. They had empty chairs at tables and had to decide whether to speak the names of those who had been taken. Some chose to speak softly, some could not yet form the sounds. By spring, fields demanded hands. Seed was a language everyone understood, even when the tongue shook. Men and women worked side by side with people they had doubted. They learned the humble skill again, how to stand close without picking at a wound. When a cartwheel sank in a muddy patch, 3 households left their own furrows to lift it free. No one said the old words. They said, "Heave," and laughed when the cart lurched forward with a rude, wet sound. Laughter felt like a guest that had been away and found its way back without asking to be asked. In Boston and the wider colony, leaders argued the law's shape in print. It would take years to put the pieces in order, years to reverse judgments, to make compensation, to write down, in slow official language, that fear had been allowed to steer the bench. But the beginning of that work sat in this season, when confessions dried up and the afflicted found their fits, losing the court's ear. A performance without an audience fades. The girls, many of them young and hurt by other kinds of loss that winter can bring, learned that the sharp edge their words had once carried now met thicker wood. Their cries still drew notice. They no longer drew rope. Those who had confessed in hope of mercy faced a different pain. Some had named neighbors who then suffered for those names. The road back for such souls was not straight. It required letters, tears, and a willingness to live under eyes that would watch them for years. In quiet corners, reconciliations were made. A man who had once pointed a finger turned up at a barn raising and worked until the light failed. He wiped his hands, met the gaze of the farmer whose brother had died, and did not look away. No words were spoken. Sometimes the only apology a village can hold is sweat. Spring turned to summer, and the trials dwindled to a trickle. The new court, having acquitted many and reprieved more, closed its book on witchcraft without ceremony. There was no banner that read "ended." There was only a widening silence around a subject that had once taken up every chair in a room. People learned to live with that silence. They did not use it to bury memory. They used it to let memory cool. Years would pass before the colony put its seal on regret. One judge's public apology became a measure in sermons. A fast day was set to ask for pardon and to seek a clean heart. Petitions for restitution moved slowly, like oxen on a hot road, but they moved. Some families received coin and a formal word that the law had been wrong. Others did not, or received less than the hurt they had known. Children grew to adulthood with the story of a parent's rope told in a quieter voice, one eye always on whether the listener could bear the telling. The minister at the center of the first troubles tried to find peace with his flock. He wrote that mistakes had been made, that he had believed he served God and neighbor, but had seen results that did not match the aim. Some forgave him and meant it. Others argued he should go, and in time he did. The pulpit changed hands, and with it the tone at the meeting-house door. The village, which had always been a narrow place with a wide sky, learned to walk across its small green without bracing for a shout. What of the afflicted? Some married and moved to other towns. Some stayed and carried the weight of their girlhood into a steady life, which is a kind of courage that does not draw ink. One, years later, stood in the same meeting house and said she was sorry. She used simple words. She asked her neighbors to believe that she had been led by fear and by a persuasion she did not understand at the time. People in the pews listened. They did not applaud. They did not hiss. They did what New Englanders do when something heavy has been lifted a little. They cleared their throats. They straightened a bonnet. They stared hard at the knot in the wood ahead of them, and they let the sound of apology move through the room until it settled. Memory is never a single sheet. It is a quilt. One family sewed a patch of grey for a father pressed under stones. Another stitched a square with a crimson thread for a sister whose words had helped and hurt. A third added a quiet color for the time their own name sat on a petition that almost no one else would sign. When the quilts were aired in the sun, women compared stitches and spoke, at last, about what had happened as if it were a storm the village had survived. The air made the cloth smell new again, though the seams told where repairs had been made. The landscape kept its own ledger. The small rise where bodies had swung did not brag about its part. Children walked past it, and a mother would steer a game to the other side of the lane without explanation. Streams that had carried whispers in 1692 carried trout again, and the bright hands of boys who went home wet to mothers who scolded and laughed. Fields forgotten during the worst months grew weeds that had to be fought back with patient effort. There is a kind of mercy in how earth asks for work and pays in food. It gives a person something to do with grief. In private houses, people divided the story into pieces they could keep. One neighbor might say, "We were wrong," and mean the whole village. Another might say, "It was the devil," and mean the sudden seizure of a mind or a fear. Another might say, "It was the law's fault," and point to books and benches. Each was trying to find a handle strong enough to lift what remained too heavy to carry any other way. The village allowed all three. It did not need a single sentence to be right. It needed to go on. The last prisoners stepped into the light. Some came home to doors that opened before they reached them. Some found a threshold that took a long time to cross, because shame lingers and so does anger. But even here there were menders. A sister who had spoken against a sister kept watch by her bed when fever came in August and did not leave until the sweat broke. A man who had mocked a neighbor in winter stood up for him in court the next year when a landline was at issue. It is an old skill, this trade of harm for help. It is how a place survives itself. Years later, when the colony wrote the final words that set records straight and cleared names in the grey comfort of legal phrasing, the sound of those words reached back to the winter when the new court first said no to a vision. The distance between the two moments was wide, but a thread ran across it: caution, humility. The choice to say we do not know rather than we are certain when certainty puts a rope on a human neck. That thread had been hard to find in early 1692. By 1693, it lay where any hand might take hold. You can stand, even now, at the edge of those fields and hear nothing but present wind. Sparrows move in hedges where once people hid their faces to weep. The meeting house has been replaced and replaced again. Names that once terrified are carved into markers that look like any other. Yet the village left us a plain gift: the knowledge that rules of proof are not cold. They are warm because they guard warm lives. That a crowd needs brakes as much as it needs wheels. That a pause inside a storm can save more than breath. It can save a soul. We close this part with a winter table, not the gallows. A family bows heads. Their prayer is brief. They eat bread that tastes a little of smoke, boiled meat, and turnip sweetened by frost. When they speak, they do not name the trouble first. They speak of fences, of a hen that has gone broody, of a child's new tooth, and of the man down the lane who, though he was harsh last year, lifted one end of a heavy beam without being asked. They are building a road back out of small boards and short nails. It holds today's echo. When fear brings a crowd to your door, ask for slower words and better proof. Choose the pause that keeps hands kind. Night lay over Rome like a shawl, warm where the lamps burned and thin in the alleys that led down to the Tiber. The city that roared by day softened to a murmur hooves on stone, a cartwheel, a late voice under a balcony. In that hush, Imagine a doorway opening onto a modest courtyard. A woman sets down a clay lamp and smooths a crease from a letter. Her name is Fulvia. She is neither a poet nor a general. She is not a magistrate, for the law would not allow it. Yet her life will travel through the hands of Rome's strongest men, and the choices she makes will shape the course of a civil age that could not keep still. Fulvia grew within an old name. The Fulvi had been known in the city for generations. The family's pride was not marble, but memory, a habit of being counted when it mattered. In that house, young Fulvia learned that Rome was a place of clients and patrons, of favours owed, of oaths spoken with palm to palm. She learned how a glance on a street could be a promise, and how a nod at a dinner table could be a map for tomorrow. She learned to read in the faces of visitors whether they brought news or need. Her first marriage took her into a storm already brewing. Publius Clodius Pulcher was a brilliant and unruly man, famous for bold moves and sharp turns. He rode the city's currents like a sailor who knows the wind by the taste of it. As tribune, he made laws that pleased the crowd and angered old families. He kept a following that felt like a small army. Men in rough tunics carried his voice into every market. They guarded him with fists and sticks in a Rome where politics and street corners were twins. Fulvia did not vanish into this noise. She watched, learned, and remembered who came to the door and what they asked. In the courtyard, she met those whom her husband's power had lifted and those whom it had crushed. She knew the risk of a raised tax and the relief of a lowered one. She understood that Rome could love a man on Monday and hate him by Thursday and still expect his wife to keep the house in order and the accounts clean. When news ran ahead of a visitor, when a neighbor's girl shouted that Claudius's men had taken a beating at the corner by the butcher's, Fulvia steadied the servants with a look and sent for oil for bruises and bread for the hungry. Calm was a craft she practiced every day. The city roared louder. Rival gangs met, and corners turned red at the edges. Then, on a winter road outside Rome, the Appian Way, that ran like a stone ribbon through the hills, Clodius fell to an enemy's escort, their quarrel swelling into a fight that left him dead on the stones. When the body reached the city, the air itself seemed to lift with heat. Fulvia opened her doors and her grief for all to see. She showed the wounds to the people, not to make a spectacle, but to tell a plain truth in a language the crowd understood. Loss, marked in flesh, counted more than rumor. The man who had burned so brightly was gone. The city that had fed on his fire now tasted ash. Rome, in its anger, pushed past the line between sorrow and rage. Claudius's followers bore his body to the forum, and a sudden blaze swallowed the wooden benches and even the old Senate house. For days, smoke carried the sting of a life turned into fuel. Fulvia stood in that smoke and did not bend. She gathered what remained of her husband's alliances, spoke to friends who had turned their faces to the wall, and reminded them that a name can still hold weight after the man is gone. She had seen up close how power is woven thread by thread, handshake by handshake. She refused to let the cloth fall apart in her hands. Time moved, as it always does, through grief toward work. Widows in Rome did not disappear, they navigated. Fulvia knew that, and she married again, Gaius Scribonius, Curio, a man as quick with his mind as he was with a smile. Curio had a gift for words and a nose for winds that were about to change. At first he stood with old senatorial power. Then he followed his judgment toward a different star, Julius Caesar, whose legions and loyalty ran deep. Curio tried to calm the growing quarrel between Caesar and the Senate by asking for equal terms. When war came anyway, he took ship and command, and he did not come home. Africa was far, and letters travel slowly when armies move. The last message bore bad news. Curio had fallen in battle against a king who sided with Caesar's enemies. Fulvia received that letter at a table where she had once counted rations for Claudius's men. She held the wax seal between finger and thumb for a long moment, as if the cool imprint might offer another sentence, a kinder one. It did not. She learned, as many Roman women learned, to make mourning into motion, to keep the house standing, to tend clients who still came, to honor the dead by steadying the living. Her third marriage tied her life to a man who stood at the center of Rome's next storms, Mark Antony. He was a soldier born to the saddle and the shout. He laughed easily, fought hard, and moved like a banner in a wind that was always changing. Yet, within the swirl around him, Fulvia found her ground. Their marriage was not a quiet retreat. It was a partnership born in noise, under the eyes of a city that judged every glance and word. Antony returned from campaigns with dust in his hair. Fulvia met him with news and lists. She did not scold the day. She organized it. The household became a workshop where letters were copied, messengers fed, and favors tracked with neat lines on wax tablets. She understood that Antony's power ran on to fuel's victory in the field and loyalty in the streets, and she meant to keep both lit. Caesar's star reached its noon, and then, in a single afternoon of knives and shock, went out. The Ides of March cut the city in two. On one side, men who claimed to have saved the Republic. On the other, men who had built their lives with Caesar and would not let his work be thrown into dust. Antony stood in the forum with the dead leader's cloak in his hands and changed the mood with a speech that had the weight of thunder. Grief bent toward anger. Rome shivered at what might come next. What came was confusion, then calculation. A young heir from the countryside, Gaius Octavius, newly named in Caesar's will, stepped into a room where every word mattered. He was quiet in his manner and sharp in his math. He moved carefully, paying debts, making allies, setting down stones where the older men had once built their own roads. Fulvia watched him, weighed him, and reached for a tool that Roman families had used since the founding. Marriage as a bridge. She offered her daughter, Claudia, born of her first marriage, to the young Octavian. The match bound Antony and Caesar's heir within one household. It made dinner tables safer and letters warmer. It told the city that peace had a chance. In a courtyard where couriers came and went, Fulvia breathed a little easier. Antony, for his part, set his name beside the heirs and alongside a third Lepidus in a formal pact that gave them power to shape the state, the triumvirs. Rome, for a moment, looked like a table with 3 legs, able to stand. Paper carried more than sermons. Petitions for mercy crossed the snow. People who had dared to sign for a neighbor before, when it was hardest, found their names looked different now, less like a risk, more like a thread that had kept part of the village from falling open. The families of the dead began their own slow work. They stood on ground no one knew how to make level. They had empty chairs at tables and had to decide whether to speak the names of those who had been taken. Some chose to speak softly, some could not yet form the sounds. By spring, fields demanded hands. Seed was a language everyone understood, even when the tongue shook. Men and women worked side by side with people they had doubted. They learned the humble skill again, how to stand close without picking at a wound. When a cartwheel sank in a muddy patch, 3 households left their own furrows to lift it free. No one said the old words. They said, "Heave," and laughed when the cart lurched forward with a rude, wet sound. Laughter felt like a guest that had been away and found its way back without asking to be asked. In Boston and the wider colony, leaders argued the law's shape in print. It would take years to put the pieces in order, years to reverse judgments, to make compensation, to write down, in slow official language, that fear had been allowed to steer the bench. But the beginning of that work sat in this season, when confessions dried up and the afflicted found their fits, losing the court's ear. A performance without an audience fades. The girls, many of them young and hurt by other kinds of loss that winter can bring, learned that the sharp edge their words had once carried now met thicker wood. Their cries still drew notice. They no longer drew rope. Those who had confessed in hope of mercy faced a different pain. Some had named neighbors who then suffered for those names. The road back for such souls was not straight. It required letters, tears, and a willingness to live under eyes that would watch them for years. In quiet corners, reconciliations were made. A man who had once pointed a finger turned up at a barn raising and worked until the light failed. He wiped his hands, met the gaze of the farmer whose brother had died, and did not look away. No words were spoken. Sometimes the only apology a village can hold is sweat. Spring turned to summer, and the trials dwindled to a trickle. The new court, having acquitted many and reprieved more, closed its book on witchcraft without ceremony. There was no banner that read ended. There was only a widening silence around a subject that had once taken up every chair in a room. People learned to live with that silence. They did not use it to bury memory. They used it to let memory cool. Years would pass before the colony put its seal on regret. One judge's public apology became a measure in sermons. A fast day was set to ask for pardon and to seek a clean heart. Petitions for restitution moved slowly, like oxen on a hot road, but they moved. Some families received coin and a formal word that the law had been wrong. Others did not, or received less than the hurt they had known. Children grew to adulthood with the story of a parent's rope told in a quieter voice, one eye always on whether the listener could bear the telling. The minister at the center of the first troubles tried to find peace with his flock. He wrote that mistakes had been made, that he had believed he served God and neighbor, but had seen results that did not match the aim. Some forgave him and meant it. Others argued he should go, and in time he did. The pulpit changed hands, and with it the tone at the meeting-house door. The village, which had always been a narrow place with a wide sky, learned to walk across its small green without bracing for a shout. What of the afflicted? Some married and moved to other towns. Some stayed and carried the weight of their girlhood into a steady life, which is a kind of courage that does not draw ink. One, years later, stood in the same meeting house and said she was sorry. She used simple words. She asked her neighbors to believe that she had been led by fear and by a persuasion she did not understand at the time. People in the pews listened. They did not applaud. They did not hiss. They did what New Englanders do when something heavy has been lifted a little. They cleared their throats. They straightened a bonnet. They stared hard at the knot in the wood ahead of them, and they let the sound of apology move through the room until it settled. Memory is never a single sheet. It is a quilt. One family sewed a patch of grey for a father pressed under stones. Another stitched a square with a crimson thread for a sister whose words had helped and hurt. A third added a quiet colour for the time their own name sat on a petition that almost no one else would sign. When the quilts were aired in the sun, women compared stitches and spoke, at last, about what had happened as if it were a storm the village had survived. The air made the cloth smell new again, though the seams told where repairs had been made. The landscape kept its own ledger. The small rise where bodies had swung did not brag about its part. Children walked past it, and a mother would steer again to the other side of the lane without explanation. Streams that had carried whispers in 1692 carried trout again, and the bright hands of boys who went home wet to mothers who scolded and laughed. Fields forgotten during the worst months grew weeds that had to be fought back with patient effort. There is a kind of mercy in how earth asks for work and pays in food. It gives a person something to do with grief. In private houses, people divided the story into pieces they could keep. One neighbor might say, "We were wrong," and mean the whole village. Another might say, "It was the devil," and mean the sudden seizure of a mind or a fear. Another might say, "It was the law's fault," and point to books and benches. Each was trying to find a handle strong enough to lift what remained too heavy to carry any other way. The village allowed all three. It did not need a single sentence to be right. It needed to go on. The last prisoners stepped into the light. Some came home to doors that opened before they reached them. Some found a threshold that took a long time to cross, because shame lingers and so does anger. But even here there were menders. A sister who had spoken against a sister kept watch by her bed when fever came in August and did not leave until the sweat broke. A man who had mocked a neighbor in winter stood up for him in court the next year when a landline was at issue. It is an old skill, this trade of harm for help. It is how a place survives itself. Years later, when the colony wrote the final words that set records straight and cleared names in the grey comfort of legal phrasing, the sound of those words reached back to the winter when the new court first said no to a vision. The distance between the two moments was wide, but a thread ran across it: caution, humility. The choice to say we do not know rather than we are certain when certainty puts a rope on a human neck. That thread had been hard to find in early 1692. By 1693, it lay where any hand might take hold. You can stand, even now, at the edge of those fields and hear nothing but present wind. Sparrows move in hedges where once people hid their faces to weep. The meeting house has been replaced and replaced again. Names that once terrified are carved into markers that look like any other. Yet the village left us a plain gift: the knowledge that rules of proof are not cold. They are warm because they guard warm lives. That a crowd needs brakes as much as it needs wheels. That a pause inside a storm can save more than breath. It can save a soul. We close this part with a winter table, not the gallows. A family bows heads. Their prayer is brief. They eat bread that tastes a little of smoke, boiled meat, and turnip sweetened by frost. When they speak, they do not name the trouble first. They speak of fences, of a hen that has gone broody, of a child's new tooth, and of the man down the lane who, though he was harsh last year, lifted one end of a heavy beam without being asked. They are building a road back out of small boards and short nails. It holds today's echo when fear brings a crowd to your door. Ask for slower words and better proof. Choose the pause that keeps hands kind. Night lay over Rome like a shawl, warm where the lamps burned and thin in the alleys that led down to the Tiber. The city that roared by day softened to a murmur hooves on stone, a cartwheel, a late voice under a balcony. In that hush, imagine a doorway opening onto a modest courtyard. A woman sets down a clay lamp and smooths a crease from a letter. Her name is Fulvia. She is neither a poet nor a general. She is not a magistrate, for the law would not allow it. Yet her life will travel through the hands of Rome's strongest men, and the choices she makes will shape the course of a civil age that could not keep still. Fulvia grew within an old name. The Fulvi had been known in the city for generations. The family's pride was not marble, but memory a habit of being counted when it mattered. In that house, young Fulvia learned that Rome was a place of clients and patrons, of favours owed, of oaths spoken with palm to palm. She learned how a glance on a street could be a promise, and how a nod at a dinner table could be a map for tomorrow. She learned to read in the faces of visitors whether they brought news or need. Her first marriage took her into a storm already brewing. Publius Clodius Pulcher was a brilliant and unruly man, famous for bold moves and sharp turns. He rode the city's currents like a sailor who knows the wind by the taste of it. As tribune, he made laws that pleased the crowd and angered old families. He kept a following that felt like a small army. Men in rough tunics carried his voice into every market. They guarded him with fists and sticks in a Rome where politics and street corners were twins. Fulvia did not vanish into this noise. She watched, learned, and remembered who came to the door and what they asked. In the courtyard, she met those whom her husband's power had lifted and those whom it had crushed. She knew the risk of a raised tax and the relief of a lowered one. She understood that Rome could love a man on Monday and hate him by Thursday and still expect his wife to keep the house in order and the accounts clean. When news ran ahead of a visitor, when a neighbour's girl shouted that Claudius's men had taken a beating at the corner by the butcher's, Fulvia steadied the servants with a look and sent for oil for bruises and bread for the hungry. Calm was a craft she practiced every day. The city roared louder. Rival gangs met, and corners turned red at the edges. Then, on a winter road outside Rome, the Appian Way that ran like a stone ribbon through the hills, Clodius fell to an enemy's escort, their quarrel swelling into a fight that left him dead on the stones. When the body reached the city, the air itself seemed to lift with heat. Fulvia opened her doors and her grief for all to see. She showed the wounds to the people, not to make a spectacle, but to tell a plain truth in a language the crowd understood. Loss, marked in flesh, counted more than rumour. The man who had burned so brightly was gone. The city that had fed on his fire now tasted ash. Rome, in its anger, pushed past the line between sorrow and rage. Claudius's followers bore his body to the forum, and a sudden blaze swallowed the wooden benches and even the old Senate house. For days, smoke carried the sting of a life turned into fuel. Fulvia stood in that smoke and did not bend. She gathered what remained of her husband's alliances, spoke to friends who had turned their faces to the wall, and reminded them that a name can still hold weight after the man is gone. She had seen up close how power is woven thread by thread, handshake by handshake. She refused to let the cloth fall apart in her hands. Time moved, as it always does, through grief toward work. Widows in Rome did not disappear, they navigated. Fulvia knew that, and she married again Gaius Scribonius, Curio, a man as quick with his mind as he was with a smile. Curio had a gift for words and a nose for winds that were about to change. At first he stood with old senatorial power. Then he followed his judgment toward a different star, Julius Caesar, whose legions and loyalty ran deep. Curio tried to calm the growing quarrel between Caesar and the Senate by asking for equal terms. When war came anyway, he took ship and command, and he did not come home. Africa was far, and letters travel slowly when armies move. The last message bore bad news. Curio had fallen in battle against a king who sided with Caesar's enemies. Fulvia received that letter at a table where she had once counted rations for Claudius's men. She held the wax seal between finger and thumb for a long moment, as if the cool imprint might offer another sentence, a kinder one. It did not. She learned, as many Roman women learned, to make mourning into motion, to keep the house standing, to tend clients who still came, to honor the dead by steadying the living, Her third marriage tied her life to a man who stood at the center of Rome's next storms, Mark Antony. He was a soldier born to the saddle and the shout. He laughed easily, fought hard, and moved like a banner in a wind that was always changing. Yet, within the swirl around him, Fulvia found her ground. Their marriage was not a quiet retreat. It was a partnership born in noise, under the eyes of a city that judged every glance and word. Antony returned from campaigns with dust in his hair. Fulvia met him with news and lists. She did not scold the day, she organized it. The household became a workshop where letters were copied, messengers fed, and favors tracked with neat lines on wax tablets. She understood that Antony's power ran on to fuel's victory in the field and loyalty in the streets, and she meant to keep both lit. Caesar's star reached its noon, and then, in a single afternoon of knives and shock, went out. The Ides of March cut the city in two. On one side, men who claimed to have saved the Republic. On the other, men who had built their lives with Caesar and would not let his work be thrown into dust. Antony stood in the forum with the dead leader's cloak in his hands and changed the mood with a speech that had the weight of thunder. Grief bent toward anger. Rome shivered at what might come next. What came was confusion, then calculation. A young heir from the countryside, Gaius Octavius, newly named in Caesar's will, stepped into a room where every word mattered. He was quiet in his manner and sharp in his math. He moved carefully, paying debts, making allies, setting down stones where the older men had once built their own roads. Fulvia watched him, weighed him, and reached for a tool that Roman families had used since the founding. Marriage as a bridge. She offered her daughter, Claudia, born of her first marriage, to the young Octavian. The match bound Antony and Caesar's heir within one household. It made dinner tables safer and letters warmer. It told the city that peace had a chance. In a courtyard where couriers came and went, Fulvia breathed a little easier. Antony, for his part, set his name beside the heirs and alongside a third Lepidus in a formal pact that gave them power to shape the state, the triumvirs. Rome, for a moment, looked like a table with 3 legs, able to stand. Death turned the quarrel's heat into a colder arithmetic. Antony and Octavian met at Brundisium in the autumn of that same year. They did what survivors of long storms do. They found a way to tie ships together and sail in one direction for a while. They split the Roman world into spheres, east for Antony, west for Octavian, with a line that ran not through hearts but through coasts and roads. They made the kind of peace that holds as long as hands stay on the same rope. To seal it, Antony married Octavia, Octavian's sister, a woman whose patience and good sense were praised by almost every voice that wrote of her. The marriage was bond, symbol, and bridge, all the things Fulvia had tried to achieve with her daughter's match and her urgent letters. The irony is clear only to those who see the whole map. Fulvia's death made space for the alliance she had once tried to build in other ways. What remains of Fulvia in Rome after her funeral? Smoke drifted into Greek sky. A name wrapped by praise and blame both. Coins from the years when Antony and his allies needed to speak to the public show a female profile that some scholars read as hers. Veiled as victory, a sign that her presence in politics was not merely an insult whispered in doorways, but a figure a mint could risk. Whether every coin shows her or only some, the rumor itself tells how visible she had become. In court records and letters preserved by chance, she appears not as a footnote, but as a person with meetings to hold and decisions to make. In the play of power that followed Caesar's death, the most dangerous theatre Rome had built, she took the stage and spoke. That is rare enough to matter. It is easy, from a long distance, to fold her into a simple shape. the fierce wife, the meddler, the patriot, the matchmaker, the last defense of a house, the first spark of a war. Lives are not simple, Fulvia's least of all. She was born into a family that knew its way through Rome's alleys of favor. She married 3 men whose names drew crowds and curses. She turned grief into plans twice, and then, the third time, into direct action because the world around her left no quieter route. When men wrote after her, they often chose the sharpest ink, but even those who disliked her admitted that she could move a room. Of her household craft, small proofs remain in the silence between lines. A letter stamped with urgency shows that messengers knew her seal. A swift pardon in a provincial town suggests that the governor was used to seeing her handwriting in Antony's packet. A rumor that she scolded leaders tells as much about the age's taste for certain stories as it does about her real voice. And the care with which some later writers crafted her as a cautionary tale that care itself says she mattered. Cautionary tales are not spun for people no one noticed. When Antony turned back toward the east after Brundisium, he carried different companions and a different peace than the one Fulvia had tried to hold. Octavian stayed in Italy and made his quiet order deeper. He learned to keep soldiers satisfied without ripping too many roots. He learned to smile at the Senate and then do what the Senate would have done if it had been brave. Antony wrote his own pages, mixing victories and errors, carefully guided alliances and bolder experiments. In those experiments, the queen from the Nile would matter more and more. Rome would argue about that for years. It argues still. Fulvia's place stood behind that argument like a foundation stone no one speaks of and everyone uses. Walk back with me, for a moment, to her last Roman morning before the sea journey. The house wakes early. A scribe warms his hands and dries ink by the brazier. A basket of figs goes from kitchen to atrium, meant for messengers who are about to ride. Lucius's men thump boots clean on the step. A woman from a hillside town waits near a column, turning a petition over in nervous fingers. Fulvia crosses the floor. She greets the woman by name. She reads the petition. She gives it back with a small mark near the top 3 letters that the right clerk will understand. She says, "Go to the forum by the upper steps. He will meet you at the 3rd column." She turns to the scribe. "Write one more. Make it short." She lifts a lamp to check the seals cooling on a string. She ties the string with a neat knot and hands the packet to a rider. "Do not change horses on the river road," she says. "Take the ridge. The river floods this week. It is the simplest business, the way a day moves from difficulty to decision to errand. And yet, that morning, repeated 100 times, is what allowed her to stand in the louder rooms and be heard. There is a strength that does not need a trumpeter. It is the strength of the person who understands lists, faces, and timing, and who will carry messages through until they touch a hand that can act. Fulvia had that strength, and in an age that carved laurels for men, it left a trace even so. Rome forgets many names and keeps a few. Fulvia's name did not reach temples, but it reached coins and curses, and those softer lines in letters where someone says, "Thanks to her, the gate opened." She left the world earlier than her story might have wished, on a foreign couch, near a blue sea, hearing gulls rather than the market of the forum. But she had already pushed the story forward as far as one person in her place could push it. After she was gone, others walked across the bridge she forced into being. Antony and Octavian made peace, then rivalry, then a history that would end in a sole ruler with a new kind of crown. Fulvia is present in the hinge of that door, whether or not her name is chiseled on the jamb. If you wish to weigh her, Do it not with the old habit of asking whether she was too bold for a woman, too meddling, too much. Ask instead how Rome had trained everyone, men and women, to think of power as a thing done in daylight by a few famous hands, when in truth it has always been made in courtyards, kitchens, and corner tables where someone writes the note that brings a man at the right hour to the right door. In those hidden workshops, Fulvia's lamp burned long. We end gently, where the Tiber glides under stone, and the evening cool settles on tiles and shoulders. Somewhere in the city that shaped her, a girl writes a name on a wax tablet and presses it flat, wanting her letters crisp. She will grow and learn that names are tools and shelters. If she ever hears Fulvia spoken, she will be told a story, perhaps kind, perhaps not. But she will also learn what the city already knows, that sometimes the difference between noise and history is simply the person who keeps the lists straight and the promises alive, today's echo, when later voices try to shrink a life to a single word. Read the ledgers, and the letters to quiet work leaves the truest marks. Before the sun found the marble of the Lincoln Memorial, Washington, D.C. felt like a great, quiet station. Buses whispered in from long roads, brakes sighing, doors folding open to shoes that had traveled all night, polished church shoes, Union boots, children's soft soles, one step and then another onto the mall's pale grass, still wet with dew. August air pressed warm against jackets draped over arms. Somewhere a radio hummed low. A distant train crossed a bridge with the steady heartbeat of iron. In that half-light, a city built of stone and rules waited for something gentler and larger than itself. A day of common voice. The date on the day's paper read August 28, 1963. The headline names were already famous. A. Philip Randolph, who had dreamed of a mass march for decades. Bayard Rustin, the careful planner with a precise mind. Ministers and organizers from the great civil rights bodies. Singers whose notes could carry a crowd like wind carries seed. And a pastor from Atlanta whose sermons had the sound of rivers finding their way to the sea. But the first sound that morning was quieter. Hands passing water jugs from the bus to the field. A grandmother checking that her granddaughter's ribbon hadn't slipped. A marshal tightening his white armband and reviewing the training. No pushing, no anger, steady lines, steady hands. The March on Washington had been called for jobs and freedom. The words went together on purpose. They said that a person needs both the key to a workplace that pays fair and the key to a front door without fear. They said that the dignity a family carries into evening after a day's labor is the same dignity a child carries when she walks into any school and knows she belongs. Across the country that summer, that truth had been carried by telegram, church bulletin, meeting in a basement or a union hall, and by quiet conversation between neighbors who had seen enough of closed doors to want to push one open together. If you stood early on the mall and turned slowly, you could see distance made human. New York church hats and Mississippi straw hats. Baltimore, Chicago, and Birmingham buttons. Homemade signs with letters brushed on the kitchen table after supper. Hand-lettered prayers, simple and plain. Now is the time. Fair vote. Decent homes. Jobs. The air had the smell of bus diesel and bread wrapped in wax paper. People from freedom houses and factory floors, college dorms and farm porches traveled to stand in the same light and say the same soft thing in 1,000 throats. We are here. This day did not arrive suddenly. It rose from years when the ground shook. The spring had seen Birmingham's children meet dogs and hoses with linked arms and songs. That summer began with a president speaking on television about a moral crisis, and ended that same night with a man named Medgar Evers shot in his own driveway. Church basements kept long hours. Volunteers copied phone lists by hand. College students slept on cots and then rose into heat to register neighbors who had been turned away too often. In kitchens, people counted coins and chose between bus fare and a new pair of shoes. The road to Washington was laid with paper flyers, pew announcements, and hope made practical. Bring water, bring food, bring patience. At the hub of all that movement, Bayard Rustin's desk became a small city. Maps were taped and retaped. Portable toilets were contracted. First aid stations marked. Routes for buses set and set again. Volunteers trained in non-violence were told how to guide a crowd, not with barked orders, but with clear hands and calm eyes. "We will show the country," he said to his team, "how discipline can look like joy." The day had a program as if for a choir, because it was one only larger, the nation as chorus, learning to hold a note together. By mid-morning, the mall was a quilt of blankets and bright umbrellas. Families found shade under elms. A child fed crumbs to a sparrow and smiled to see it bold. Vendors sold paper fans that showed famous faces and famous lines. The reflecting pool warmed, and people sat along its edge with shoes off, feet in water, laughter low and easy. Police officers watched from a distance, hands loose at their sides. They had been briefed, too. The city had been nervous and had prepared for many things. What it met was a crowd that behaved like Sunday school at an enormous scale, orderly, dressed as if for service, polite, and humming with purpose. The march did not begin with a march. It began with gathering and with music. Voices to set breath, rhythm to remind feet what shared time felt like. Singers who were already threads in the fabric of the freedom movement tuned guitars and warmed their own voices. You could hear familiar melodies climb into the air and float toward the memorial steps where microphones waited like open hands. Songs do not argue, they invite. On that morning, they invited strangers to become we for a day. Somewhere behind the stage, old arguments still had edges. Movements are made of many minds, and minds do not always agree. What words should be said from the steps? How hard should they sound against the ear of the country? Young organizers whose bravery had carried them through southern roads warned that the nation's patience for mild language had run thin. Older leaders, who knew how easily a headline could be made harsh and used against a bill in Congress, asked for phrases that would hold both fire and care. Drafts were written, read, and revised, while the crowd's sound rolled forward like distant surf. The work of a day can include both the drum of marching feet and the pencil whisper of a clause changed to save a coalition. On this day it did. There were numbers, too. Beyond the poetry, the 10 demands, people called them. A strong civil rights law with teeth. Fair employment practices that would end the silent sign, not here. A higher national wage, so a full day's work would carry a household through the week. Equal access to schools and public space. And justice in the vote, so that a ballot could not be turned away by tricks and fees. The word jobs did not mean only one kind of job. It meant the chance to be paid fairly for honest labor, to stand with dignity at the end of a shift, to bring pay home and know it would stretch to rent, to food, to shoes for a growing child. The word freedom did not mean only a seat on a bus. It meant the open door that follows a fair vote and the quiet heart that follows a fair law. Speakers and singers lined the steps in a patient row. On a small table lay a program printed in plain type. At its top stood the names of those whose organizing had brought this river of people to this exact bend: Randolph, the elder with the conductor's calm; Rustin, the arranger who had made a city-scale hymn; leaders from the NAACP, SCLC, SNCC, Corps, and the Urban League. Labor voices who spoke the language of union halls, and faith leaders who brought the good trouble of prophets into the daylight. There were women on that platform, singers whose songs had steadied marches, organizers who had risked as much as anyone, but the list of formal speakers did not match their numbers in the work. A tribute to women would be offered to name some of what had been done, a sign of the present's limit and the future's correction both. Movements are made by many hands. The record takes time to catch up. Close to noon, when heat pressed and the shade of the memorial felt like a harbor, a Philip Randolph stepped forward first. He carried the days, opening the way. A seasoned captain carries a ship into a busy harbor shore, slow and watchful. He spoke with the kind of patience that does not come from weakness, but from long years of waiting and work. He reminded the crowd of how long the idea had lived, since the early 1940s, when a mass march had been planned to demand defense jobs without discrimination, and had won a promise without the procession. Today, his presence said as much as his words. We walk the promise out in the open for all to see. As speeches began, the mall found its breath. People fanned faces, shared water, switched a little by blanket corners to let an elder sit. Every few minutes, the crowd did what living things do in heat. It rippled, adjusting, then settled again. Many came with paper lunches and split them into smaller halves so that food could walk farther than wind. Parents kept an eye on children plucking at the grass. The youngest learned that a great event is made of ordinary minutes strung together quiet between claps, waiting between songs, and the long, good hum of being near so many who wish what you wish. From the platform, messages struck different notes: petition, warning, story, prayer. A labor leader's vowels carried the old strength of the shop floor. A civil rights lawyer's clean sentences told how law can become a shield when written with care. A minister's cadence rose and fell like the tide against stone and made the farthest edges of the crowd feel near. A young organizer spoke with sharp honesty about the limits of patience where sheriffs, clubs, and courthouse tricks still stood across a door. The text he read that day had been tempered by debate in the morning's heat. Out on the grass, no one saw those edits. They heard only courage. And in the shade behind the microphones, people who had argued an hour before now nodded at one another, because the point of an argument is not victory. It is a better path. Music threaded through the words. Harmonies rose and carried the day forward when feet grew heavy. A singer known for gospel power poured a river of sound across the pool, and in it worry loosened. A trio whose voices had walked with marchers all summer lifted a folk song into the air, and it floated as lightly as the paper doves on a child's sign. There were moments when the crowd became a single mouth singing. There were moments when the only sound was wind passing over a million leaves, and the speakers on the steps stood in a framed silence so large it made even the Capitol stone seem soft. By early afternoon, the day's shape was clear. It would be long but peaceful. It would be hot but kind. Volunteers moved like water through the channels between blankets, pointing out first aid, returning a lost child to a weeping father, reminding friends to take shade, to sip slowly, to keep smiles ready for tired officers who wanted the day to end as calmly as it had begun. In a city that feared broken glass, not even a window shook. The most dangerous thing on the grounds was the strength of so many gentle hearts gathered at once. Toward the end of the program, you could feel a lean in the air, not a shove, but an expectation. People glanced toward the steps where a man in a dark suit waited with notes. He had already spoken 100 times in 100 towns and made people who were tired want to stand up again. His words had the habit of taking an ordinary sentence and turning it so the light hit it new. In the thick air of the mall, a singer near the microphones said softly to him what he already knew deep in his bones, to tell the dream. But that moment that turned from the printed page to a line that had lived in his sermons before that day belongs to a later part of the story. For now, hold the picture of the mall as the afternoon leans forward. Everywhere you look, you see hands raised not in fists, but in praise. Amen-s. That sound like wind in pines, and faces wet with both heat and relief at being many together. You see signboards resting on knees like small boats at anchor. Pass the bill, end bias. Let my vote count. You see an old man with a union pin wiping his eyes, and a young woman from a freedom school passing him a handkerchief and calling him sir. You see two policemen, hats off, drinking water handed them by a teenager whose shoes are too tight. You see the marble behind the speakers, where a seated figure carved half a century before looks out at a crowd that has finally come half finally before looks out at a crowd that has finally come to come in his funness, with a premise of my sexual of what I will ebonize to see you is, so I pen seek a beloved with you, so what I but they do let the beau and never to be we don't we don't we you what will what why for I what with what I what I or I what I with I what I what we you will I with you and you see the arc that brought them, a porters' union that learned to organize in trains and stations and taught a country to listen. Students who learned to sit without moving while taunts rained down. Freedom riders who saw a bus set to flame and walked back onto another bus. Pastors and laywomen, rabbis and priests, who found in their books the same word justice, and where they could not agree on doctrine, they agreed on doors that should be open and votes that should not be stolen. The marchers brought their cities with them in small ways. In one corner, a group from Detroit sang what they sang on long lines at shift's end. In another, a choir from a little Alabama church joined hands with a youth chorus from Los Angeles and tried a new harmony that made them laugh. A row of union members from a foundry held their signs at exactly the same angle, more from habit than from instruction. Two school teachers who had never been this far from home watched the crowd with wonder and whispered how they would tell their students, plainly, gently, with details the children could hold. Above all, the day carried the careful hand of planning. Spaces were left open for breath and shade. A line of first aid tents stood where they would be easy to find, but out of the way. Lost and Found had a banner and a woman with a voice that could carry the names of wandering children without fear. Trained marshals kept to the sides of paths, not to control but to help. If a wheel came off a stroller, someone found a way to bind it. If a shoe came apart at the heel, a stranger with string made a fix. The kindnesses were small. There some felt like weather. The capital itself seemed to listen. Office windows above the avenues filled with faces. Some smiled. Some looked puzzled. Some looked away. People in hotels who had flown in for other business poured coffee and asked bellman what the crowd was like. And the bellman said, peaceful and big and something to see. Not far away, in rooms where phones never stop, officials marked the hour, checked the lines to the hill, and waited to see if the day would carry a bill in its hands when it left. When the time came for the last stretches of the program, even the children quieted. A prayer went up that did not ask for enemies to fall, only for hearts to open and courage to last. A final list of the day's demands was read into the record with a clerk's care and a prophet's heart, and the man the crowd had leaned toward stepped forward to speak. His first sentences were measured, marked on paper. Then, as if a door opened inside the day, his cadence turned, and the word that had been waiting all summer took its place at the front of his tongue. We will keep that door for the next part. For now, remember the steps, the heat, the water cups, the soft claps, the paper fans, the shoes set side by side at the reflecting pool, and the way a city of strangers learned one another's names without asking. History often shows itself in loud colors. Sometimes it keeps a bedtime palette soft gold light on stone, green shade, blue summer sky, and 100,000 quiet hearts learning to beat together. Today's echo, when a day asks you to be one small thread in a vast, good cloth, hold your place gently and firmly. Someone far away is counting on your thread to hold. Heat pressed gently on the stone and water, and the afternoon leaned forward. The microphones stood like clear glasses on a table. Pages rustled in careful hands. Behind the lectern, a small knot of singers and organizers watched the crowd as one watches a tide to know when to cast a net. A woman in a bright dress dabbed her brow and smiled at a child on a parent's shoulders. A marshal in a white cap lifted 2 fingers this way, slow, and the crowd obeyed because the day felt like a promise you do not wish to bruise. From the steps, speakers stitched the morning's hopes into sentences. One voice, measured and loyally, named the gap between the Constitution's text and the daily life of those gathered. Another voice, shaped by union halls, explained how a fair wage steadies a home like a beam across rafters. A minister's cadence lifted like a bell. A young organizer, whose early draft had been hammered by morning debate, kept its courage and its respect both. Words settled over the reflecting pool in soft layers. People nodded, not as if they were being convinced for the first time, but as if the day were confirming what they had carried for years. Music threaded through everything, holding breath steady when heat threatened to scatter it. A folk trio sang a tune that had walked dusty roads all summer and learned new harmony from every porch it passed. A gospel singer's voice rolled down the steps like cool water. A choir lifted a spiritual that had once steadied trembling hands at lunch counters and in jail cells, and now it steadied a city built to look unshakable. Even the police at the edges let their shoulders drop in time with the rhythm. You could feel a quiet lesson moving through the air. Discipline can look like joy. Then the pivot of the afternoon arrived, not with a shout, but with a gentle nudge from a friend. A pastor in a dark suit took his place at the microphones, papers ready with a carefully crafted text. He began as planned. He named checks that had come back marked insufficient, promises not yet kept, and the need for action that was firm but peaceful. He was clear, steady, and already good. Then from beside the podium, a voice he knew and trusted rose like a reminder from a pew. Tell them about the dream. He looked up. He set the typed pages to one side, as if placing a lid on a pot that no longer needed watching, and he reached for what his heart had carried through church basements, courthouses, and midnight meetings. He told a dream he had shared before in sanctuaries and rallies, only now the dream found the stone and water of the nation's capital to hold its echo. He spoke of a day when the nation would live out the meaning of its creed, when children would be judged by the content of their character, when the rough places would be made plain and the crooked places straight. He spoke as if building a house in the air, beam by beam, window by window, and all the windows opened. A hush fell that was not silence, but a tension so complete it sounded like one breath. Then, at the end, he called for a freedom that would ring from hills and hamlets, from every state, until the old song at last belonged to all who had sung it for generations in hope. The last lines rose like doves from the steps and glided down the pool, across the grass, and over the heads of people who knew exactly what it felt like to carry a promise through dry seasons. When the applause came, it was not the roar of a stadium. It was the long sound of relief of a crowd recognizing itself in a sentence large enough to hold both grief and resolve. People looked at one another with the small, private smile that says, "I will remember where I was when I heard that." Some wept and felt no need to hide it. Others simply closed their eyes and let the words settle like cool shade. The program continued with prayers and closing remarks. A tribute named the work of women who had organized, sung, trained, negotiated, and kept the movement's doors open when storms tried to shut them. It was not a complete answer to old exclusions, but it was a public nod toward the truth that the day's calm power had been built by many unglamorous hands. A final recitation of the march's demands put spine under the poetry, a strong civil rights law, an end to discrimination in hiring, a fair minimum wage, justice in housing and education, and the ballot guarded against tricks and educase, and the ballot guarded gullet and gullets, and gullets and dullards, and when or whens of gens. When we know or when undone what we own and will un when what we don't love what we will we don't what we will I thought I will what we will what I what or what I what or I we The list was simple in its words and large in its effect, like a house rule pinned beside a kitchen door. This is how we will live. As the program drew to a close, the crowd moved as it had arrived without panic. With patience, 100,000 small courtesies. People gathered their blankets and paper fans, their hand-painted signs and wax paper lunches. Strangers helped older marchers to their feet. A group from a small church in Georgia formed a circle for a last verse. A circle from Detroit drifted by and joined, because melody is a borderless map. First aid tents folded their canvas. Volunteers ran lost and found like a family porch, names called small reunions, laughter soft with relief. The grass showed the day's weight, but it also showed how lightly that weight had rested. Bins filled with paper. Cups were stacked. The mall breathed out. In government buildings not far away, telephones began to ring with a different tone. The day had promised no single miracle. It had promised a new pressure, steady, visible, and undeniable. Staffers who had expected a march to be messy now reported that it had been orderly and vast. Editors who had set aside space for trouble wrote instead about peace. The number itself more than 200,000. Many said 250,000 ran like a clean line through every story. 2 elected officials who still liked to count before they felt. The day offered a ledger entry. There are more of us than you thought, and we can arrive together without breaking a window. Night came, kind and warm. Buses eased onto roads like slow ships leaving a bright harbor. Songs traveled out the windows and folded into the dark. In hotel rooms across the city, organizers met in small circles, legs up on extra chairs, shoes off, eyes red with heat and triumph. Philip Randolph looked at the day he had dreamed of since the 1940s and smiled the quiet smile of a conductor who has brought a long train in on time. Bayard Rustin maps folded now, contracts signed, radios silent, reviewed the few small gaps, the many small saves, and the thousands small saves, and the thousands of invisible decisions that had made the day, then finally let him file I let mal last, and fight to sem with ends with what I can, and want to sow with was as to what will I and with a love to so better with we bub you can, I below we don't know I go what I what will what why I or what I or and if it what why or why and I where would what or Younger leaders, some pleased, some impatient, carried new arguments into the night. How to keep the urgency, how to guard against slow hands in Congress, how to make the word jobs live up to its full meaning from Alabama to Harlem to Watts. Elsewhere in the city, a pastor took off his tie in a modest room and placed his notes on a table. The typed pages and the unscripted river now lay side by side. He knew the difference. He also knew that tomorrow would ask again for measured sentences in rooms where pens can halt or free a law, and for courage in streets where songs hold a line when tempers rise. He slept with a mind already walking toward the next town. What did the day do? Once the buses had vanished down the highways and the grass found its green again, it changed the country's ear. The sound of a vast, peaceful choir in the capital did not vanish when doors shut. It lingered in committee rooms, in union halls, in living rooms, where neighbors who had stayed home looked at one another and said, maybe. The bills that had moved like reluctant cattle began to move as if someone had opened a gate. The Civil Rights Act bent through debate and became law the next summer. The Voting Rights Act followed 2 seasons later. These were not gifts from above. They were the legal faces of a movement that had found a way to hold courage without letting it spill. The day also wrote a ledger in hearts. A child who had gripped a paper fan on the mall learned how it feels to be safe in a crowd that large. A police officer who had expected anger learned what patience looks like at scale. A government clerk, watching from a window, turned from skepticism to respect and quietly told a cousin in a different state that the stories on the radio were true. A union man who had come for wages listened to a preacher and went home with his mind wider. A choir girl who had come for freedom listened to a labor leader and went home with her pockets full of new words. These are small changes. They are the ones that last. Not every voice felt satisfied. Some young organizers believed the speeches too soft, the demands to round at the corners. They wanted the day to strike like a hammer, and instead it moved like a river-steady, patient, carving stone over time. Their impatience was not a fault. It was a fuel that would be needed on grim days when dogs, fire hoses, billy clubs, and bombs tried to change the subject. The movement would need both tempers, the patient architect and the urgent drummer, prayer and picket, a sermon for the heart and a statute for the book. The march made room for both without pretending they were the same. Women who had built the day looked at the platform and saw fewer formal speeches than their labor had earned. They felt the sting and told themselves and each other that next time the balance must be better. Many times more it would be. They went home and kept doing the work that receives fewer statues, organizing rides, setting up meetings, raising money, writing press releases, opening their living rooms to travelers, keeping lists, talking with sheriffs and deacons, preparing young marchers for what to expect when a door slams and how to keep their own hands gentle anyway. Change often hides in this kind of work. It is slow, faithful, and stubborn. In another corner of the city that night, Some officials frowned and wrote memos urging caution. Not everyone loved what they had seen. Surveillance files grew as quietly as dew. The movement knew that attention could be a bridge and a trap. It kept walking anyway, head up, with the discipline of people who mean to outlast storms. The march did not end danger. It reminded those who carried danger that the country had eyes, and those eyes had seen a different way to be together in public space. Memory took its own path. Photographs captured hands raised like open windows, faces tilted toward the sun, signs painted in kitchens, smiles passing between strangers the way water passes hand to hand at a fire. The image of a pastor at the microphones, body leaning into the wind of his own words, traveled the world. Teachers pinned pictures to classroom bulletin boards and made lesson plans that ended with a promise to revisit the topic when the bill becomes law. Church bulletins described the day in plain language, no exclamation marks, because the weight of the thing needed no decoration. Back home, the marchers turned the great day into small habits. A woman in Baltimore added 2 new names to her voter registration list and walked 3 blocks to knock on doors. A man in Jackson found his courage again for the courthouse line after a long summer of refusals. A family in Chicago used the day's glow to sit longer with the question of where to move, which school district might carry their children safest into adulthood. A college student, back from Washington with a sunburned nose and the word freedom folded in his pocket like a receipt, signed up for the next training to go south and register voters. The river had split into 1,000 streams, all moving toward the same sea, and Washington itself kept a trace. If you stand there on a late summer afternoon and let your eyes rest on the water, the stone, the elms, you can still feel what a million careful steps sound like when added together. The mall remembers order, not as stiffness, but as shared kindness, the way a city can hold so many without tipping, and the way a nation can listen when it wishes. You can imagine the old program on the table, its simple type and tidy lines, and beneath it the map of the day, where the first aid tents stood, where the buses idled, where the lost children were reunited, where a singer whispered to a preacher and changed the afternoon's weather. The dream spoken that day did not make the country perfect. It made a standard by which to measure progress without cruelty. It gave language to letters written in small towns and to laws drafted in rooms where marble columns sometimes make people forget their first promises. It is a dream sturdy enough to be borrowed by new fights, by workers asking for safety, by immigrants asking for welcome, by those who love in ways the law once turned away because the dream is not owned. It is offered, and offering is how it keeps its light. As evening gathered, a bus rolled through a Carolina dusk. Inside, a girl leaned on her grandmother's shoulder and asked if the day would matter. The grandmother patted her hand and answered in the style of those who have waited a long time. It already has. You won't see all of it this week, but listen for the change. It will be in the way people speak to you at the window, in the way the man at the counter takes your money without a test in his eyes, in the sound of doors that used to stick opening a little easier, and in the way you lift your chin when you say your name. The girl fell asleep with that answer, and the bus hummed on. We end where we began, with quiet steps and shared breath. A city built of rules made room for a day of grace. Stone listened to song, law bent toward fairness. Crowds behaved like good neighbors. The afternoon turned a sermon into a shared intention, and then, when it was time, people left in peace and took the day home to make it last. And so the night falls quiet, carrying their whispers into silence. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss another whisper in the night. Until we meet again. Good night.